The smell of the mess hall was a suffocating blend of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and boiling grease. For 3 days, Maeve Calder had scrubbed the long timber tables, her hands plunged into harsh lye water until the skin blistered and peeled. She had done it willingly, believing her brother's promises. "Just a few days of work to cover our boarding, Maeve," Liam had said, his smile as easy and empty as a snake's. "Seamus and I will secure the claim, and we'll be rich. You just hold down the fort." They hadn't gone to secure a gold claim. They had gone to the gambling tents. Now the heavy wooden doors of the mess hall were barred against the biting wind of the incoming storm, and 50 rugged miners watched with predatory amusement as Silas Dawson, the camp boss, clamped his thick hand around Maeve's wrist. "Let go of me," Maeve demanded, her voice cutting through the laughter. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She stood rigid, her back straight, a striking flame of defiance beneath the grime that coated her face. Her red hair, usually pinned tightly beneath a faded cap, had begun to fall in loose, disheveled strands. Dawson smiled, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "You're not going anywhere, girlie. Your brothers left a few hours ago on the southbound stagecoach, but they left a little something behind to settle their tabs." With his free hand, Dawson reached into his vest pocket and slapped a folded piece of heavy paper onto the table. It was a promissory note. At the bottom, written in Liam's elegant, deceitful handwriting, was a pledge of labor. $300 in gambling debts, Dawson sneered, leaning in close enough for Maeve to smell the cheap rye whiskey on his breath. "And your name is signed right here as collateral. You work for me now, and not just in the kitchen." The realization hit Maeve like a physical blow to the stomach. Her own blood. The boys she had raised after their mother died. The brothers she had followed into the brutal frontier. They had thrown her away. They had priced her at $300 and left her to the wolves. The men in the hall began to jeer, banging their tin cups against the tables. A suffocating panic threatened to crush her chest, but Maeve bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. Beneath the heavy canvas of her stained apron, her blistered right hand curled around the wooden handle of a stolen paring knife. If Dawson tried to pull her toward the back rooms, she would bury the blade in his thigh. She might not survive the camp, but she would not go down as a victim. "I didn't sign that," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "It's a forgery. Now take your hand off me." "Frontier law, sweetheart," Dawson laughed, yanking her forward. "Paper says you're mine." Suddenly, the heavy iron latch of the main door lifted with a loud metallic clack. The doors were shoved open, slamming against the log walls with the force of a cannon shot. A blast of freezing air and swirling snow rushed into the stifling room, extinguishing the oil lanterns near the entrance. The laughter died instantly. The banging of tin cups stopped. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked less like a human and more like a force of nature. He was massive, easily standing 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to eclipse the storm behind him. He wore a heavy coat of uncured bear hide, the thick fur dusted with fresh snow. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but beneath it, piercing, ice-clear gray eyes swept the room. A faint, jagged scar peeked out from the collar of his shirt, running up the side of his weathered neck. It was Ronan Hayes. The miners called him the Mountain Devil. He was a solitary trapper who lived near the tree line, a man rumored to have killed 3 outlaws with his bare hands a decade ago. Ronan stepped fully into the room. His heavy boots thudded against the floorboards, the only sound in the dead silent hall. He didn't look at the miners. He didn't look at Dawson's face. His eyes were locked on Dawson's thick hand wrapped around Maeve's wrist. Ronan walked slowly to the table. He reached inside his heavy coat and pulled out a swollen canvas pouch. He raised it and brought it down hard on the table, right on top of the promissory note. The heavy, unmistakable thud of raw gold dust echoed in the quiet room. $300. Ronan's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the chest. It wasn't a question. Dawson stared at the pouch, his grip on Maeve loosening slightly in his shock. Hayes? What do you care about a camp girl? This is family business. Her brothers signed her over. She ain't your property, Ronan said flatly. The debt is paid. Dawson puffed up his chest, though his eyes darted nervously to the heavy hunting knife strapped to Ronan's thigh. She's collateral, Hayes. She stays until I say the paper is cleared. Ronan finally lifted his gaze to meet Dawson's. The stillness in the trapper's eyes was terrifying. It was the look of a man who had survived avalanches and wolves. A man who did not make empty threats. Take your hand off her, Ronan said, his voice dropping an octave, or I'll take the hand. Dawson's hand snapped back as if he had been burned. The heavy silence in the mess hall pressed inward, suffocating and tense, as the camp boss stared at the mountain man. Dawson was a ruthless man who built his fortune on the broken backs of desperate miners, but he was not a fool. You didn't cross the mountain devil over a forged piece of paper. Slowly, Dawson reached out and snatched the heavy pouch of gold dust. He weighed it in his palm, his jaw tight with humiliated fury. Fine, the debt is settled. Take her, but don't expect a refund when she freezes halfway up the ridge. Ronan didn't respond. He reached out with a large, leather-clad hand and picked up the promissory note from the table. He folded it deliberately, slipping it into the inner pocket of his bear-hide coat. He didn't look at Dawson again. Instead, his piercing gray eyes shifted to Maeve. "Get your things," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it left no room for argument. Maeve stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her right hand remained buried deep in the pocket of her dirty canvas apron, her blistered fingers still wrapped tightly around the wooden handle of the paring knife. She looked at the giant of a man before her. He had just bought her for $300. Men in this brutal front here did not spend that kind of fortune out of the goodness of their hearts. They spent it to own things. "I have nothing," Maeve said, her voice raspy but steady. "Only what I'm wearing." Ronan's gaze dropped briefly to her raw red hands, then to the thin homespun dress and the stained apron. He nodded once. "Then we walk." He turned his broad back on the room and walked out into the roaring storm. Maeve hesitated for a fraction of a second. She looked at Dawson's sneering face, at the leering eyes of the miners, and then at the open doorway leading into the blinding whiteout. With her jaw set in a hard line of defiance, she stepped out into the snow, leaving the suffocating heat of the mess hall behind. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind howled down the canyon, carrying sharp crystals of ice that stung her freckled cheeks like tiny needles. Within 10 steps, the hem of her skirt was soaked and freezing stiff. Ronan was untying a massive, dark-coated mule from the hitching post. He looked back and saw Maeve shivering violently, her thin arms wrapped around her chest. Without a word, Ronan reached into the saddlebags. He pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket and walked toward her. Maeve instinctively took a half-step back, her hand tightening on the hidden knife. If he tried to touch her, to claim what he had just bought, she would fight. But Ronan didn't touch her. He simply draped the heavy wool over her shoulders, pulling the edges forward so she could grip them. "Keep it tight to your neck," he instructed, his deep voice barely carrying over the wind. "Stay exactly in my tracks. The snow is deep." He turned and began to break the trail up the mountain, leading the mule. Maeve pulled the coarse wool tightly around her. The blanket smelled of wood smoke, pine pitch, and old leather. A rugged, clean scent that sharply contrasted with the rancid odor of the mining camp. The ascent was brutal. For 2 hours they climbed the steep, winding trail into the high timber. The world around them vanished into a swirling, blinding void of white. Maeve's lungs burned with every breath of the thin, freezing air. Her blistered hands throbbed in agony as she gripped the blanket, the raw skin cracking further in the freezing temperatures. Yet she did not utter a single word of complaint. She focused on the massive footprints Ronan left in the snow, forcing her boots into the indentations. She was calculating her odds of survival. He paid $300, she thought, her mind racing. He didn't save me. He bought me. I just traded a camp full of masters for one solitary monster. The rumors she had heard in the mess hall echoed in her mind. They said the mountain devil dragged his kills back to his cave, that he spoke to no one, that he was more beast than man. Ahead of her, Ronan stopped. Maeve froze, bracing herself. But he didn't look back. Instead, he shifted his position, moving to her left. He placed his massive frame directly between her and the howling crosswind sweeping off the glacier, effectively acting as a human shield against the worst of the storm. He slowed his pace slightly, matching her exhausted rhythm. It was a small, silent adjustment. It required no words, but the sudden relief from the biting wind was profound. Maeve stared at his broad back, a knot of confusion forming in her chest. By dusk, the timber broke, revealing a secluded shelf of rock entirely shielded by towering pines. Nestled against the granite wall was a cabin built of massive, unpeeled cedar logs. It looked like a fortress. Ronan tied the mule under a sturdy lean-to and walked to the heavy oak door. He lifted the iron latch and pushed it open. The interior was dark and completely silent. He stepped inside and struck a match, lighting a kerosene lantern hanging from a roof beam. Maeve stopped at the threshold. The light spilled out onto the snow, painting a golden rectangle at her feet. Inside was warmth, shelter, and survival. But as she gripped the handle of her hidden knife, her heart hammered against her ribs. Crossing that threshold meant stepping into the devil's cage. Ronan turned around, standing in the center of the room. He saw her, hesitating outside in the freezing wind. He didn't order her inside. He didn't demand obedience. "The fire needs lighting," he said quietly, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "And you need to thaw your hands before the frostbite sets." Maeve stepped over the threshold. The heavy oak door shut behind her with a solid, echoing thud, immediately slicing off the deafening howl of the blizzard. The sudden quiet in the cabin was startling, broken only by the scrape of Ronan's match and the hungry crackle of dry kindling catching fire in the cast-iron stove. She stood frozen near the door, her eyes adjusting to the blooming orange light. She expected a filthy hovel, a beast's lair that matched the brutal rumors of the mountain devil. Instead, she found a space of meticulous, Spartan order. The walls were tightly chinked, radiating the deep, rich scent of raw cedar. Tools were hung with precision on wooden pegs. The floorboards were swept clean of dirt. It was the home of a man who demanded discipline from himself, not from others. Ronan fed a larger split log into the stove and closed the iron grate. He turned, his massive frame silhouetted by the firelight, and walked to a wooden washstand. He poured water from a metal pitcher into a tin basin, setting it atop the stove to heat. "Take the coat off," said, his back to her as he searched a small wooden shelf. "You'll sweat, and then you'll freeze when the fire burns low." Maeve hesitated, her fingers still gripping the edges of the heavy wool blanket he had given her. Beneath her stained canvas apron, her right hand remained fiercely clamped around the wooden handle of her stolen paring knife. Slowly, she let the blanket slip from her shoulders. It fell to the floor in a heavy heap. She stood in her damp, threadbare dress, shivering as the lingering cold fought the rising heat of the stove. Ronan turned around, holding a clean scrap of linen and a small tin of salve. He pulled a sturdy wooden chair near the fire and pointed to it. "Sit." It wasn't a command from a master to a servant. It was the low, steady instruction of a man evaluating a wounded animal. Maeve moved stiffly, lowering herself onto the edge of the chair. Ronan brought the steaming tin basin and knelt on the floorboards in front of her. The sheer size of the man was overwhelming. Up close, the faint, faded scar running up the side of his neck was visible in the firelight, a jagged line that disappeared into his thick, dark beard. He placed the basin at her feet and looked up at her defensive posture. "Hands," he said. Maeve's breath hitched. She kept her right hand buried in her apron pocket. She offered her left hand, the skia, in red, raw, and weeping clear fluid from 3 days of boiling lye water and relentless scrubbing at the mining camp. Ronan's jaw tightened imperceptibly as he took in the damage. He didn't ask who had done it. He knew the cruelty of the camps. He reached out and gently took her wrist. His hands were massive, rough as unpolished stone, heavily calloused from years of gripping an axe and hauling traps. Yet, the moment his fingers curled around her arm, his touch was shockingly light. "The lye eats the skin," Ronan murmured, dipping the linen cloth into the warm water. "If it cracks down to the meat, you'll lose the fingers to infection." He began to clean the raw skin. The warm water stung fiercely, and Maeve hissed through her teeth, her body instinctively jerking back. Ronan didn't grip harder to hold her in place. He simply stopped, waiting for her to steady herself before resuming his work. His patience was unnerving. "I need the other one," he said quietly, finishing the left hand. Maeve stared at him. Her right hand was her only defense. If she pulled it out, she would have to relinquish her grip on the knife. She looked into his ice-clear grey eyes. There was no mockery there, no ownership, and no threat. Just a quiet, immovable expectation. Slowly, her fingers uncurled from the wooden handle inside her apron. She drew her right hand out, trembling slightly, and placed it over the basin. The blisters here were worse, torn open by the friction of gripping the blanket on the steep climb. Ronan methodically cleaned the wounds, applied a thick pine-scented salve that immediately dulled the throbbing pain, and wrapped her palms in clean linen strips. When he was finished, he stood up, taking the basin away. Maeve watched him, the confusion in her chest twisting into a tight knot. She looked across the small room. There was only one bed, built of thick timber and strung with rawhide netting, piled high with thick bear pelts. "I won't fight you," Maeve said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it cold. She was exhausted, broken by the climb and the betrayal of her blood. "But I won't pretend to be grateful for being bought." Ronan paused by the shelf. He didn't look back at her. He walked to a wooden chest, pulled out 2 thick wool blankets and tossed them onto the floorboards, directly across the heavy oak door. "Bed is yours," Ronan said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "I sleep by the door, keeps the draft out." Maeve stared at him in utter disbelief. She watched as the giant of a man laid his heavy coat on the hard wood, turning his back to the room and placing his massive body squarely between her and the outside world. He wasn't caging her in, he was standing guard. Slowly, Maeve walked to the bed. She slipped beneath them, the heavy bear pelts, the warmth seeping into her frozen bones. But as she lay in the flickering firelight, listening to the steady, deep breathing of the mountain devil on the floor, her right hand slid back under her apron, her bandaged fingers wrapping loosely around the hidden knife. The cabin was safe, but the world that had thrown her away was still out there, waiting in the dark. When Maeve woke, the cabin was empty. The storm still raged outside, the wind throwing hard pellets of ice against the heavy wooden shutters. But inside, the air was thick with the comforting heat of the cast-iron stove. She sat up, pulling the heavy bear pelts around her shoulders. Ronan's massive hide coat was gone from the floorboards by the door. On the small wooden table in the center of the room, a tin cup of black coffee steamed next to a plate of dry biscuits and a slice of salt pork. He had prepared her breakfast and slipped out into the blizzard before she even stirred. Maeve swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her body ached from the brutal climb, and her hands throbbed beneath the neat linen bandages Ronan had applied the night before. She walked to the table and drank the coffee. It was bitter and strong, tasting faintly of chicory and wood smoke. She looked around the room. It was practical and sturdy, but it was the domain of a man who viewed food and shelter merely as fuel to survive the next day. Stacks of cured hides were piled haphazardly in one corner. Sacks of flour, dried beans, and wild onions were jumbled together in a rough-hewn root box. Maeve thought of her brothers. She thought of Liam's smooth lies and Seamus's cowardly silence as they signed her life away to pay for a bad hand of cards. They had always treated her as a fixture, an unpaid servant whose only purpose was to scrub their floors and balance their ledgers, and when she ceased to be useful, she became currency. A cold, familiar anger tightened her jaw. She was not currency. She was not a pet to be kept warm by the fire, and she was certainly not a hostage waiting out a storm. Maeve set her tin cup down. She untied the filthy canvas apron she had worn since the mining camp and tossed it into the wash basin. From the deep pocket of the apron, she retrieved the stolen paring knife. She looked at the wooden handle. at the short, sharp blade she had fully intended to bury in Dawson's neck. She walked over to the root box. She didn't sheathe the weapon. She repurposed it. Despite the stinging pain in her blistered palms, Maeve went to work. She was the forgotten architect of her family, a woman who knew how to stretch a pound of flour through a bitter winter. She sorted the chaotic pantry. She found a heavy Dutch oven, scooped a pot full of clean snow from just outside the heavy door, and set it on the stove to melt. She used the paring knife to slice through a tough block of dried venison, peeling wild onions and dried root vegetables, tossing them into the boiling water with a pinch of salt from a tin on the shelf. For 3 hours, she didn't stop moving. The cabin slowly transformed. The chaos of solitary survival gave way to the rhythm of a functioning home. The sharp, metallic smell of raw cedar was soon overpowered by the rich, savory aroma of venison stew simmering in the iron pot. Near midday, the heavy oak door shuddered. The iron latch lifted, and Ronan stepped inside, bringing a cloud of freezing vapor with him. He was covered in a thick layer of snow, his breath pluming in the air. In his gloved hand, he carried a brace of trapped winter hares. He kicked the door shut and stopped dead in his tracks. Ronan's ice-clear eyes swept the room. He saw the neatly stacked provisions. He saw his scattered trapping gear organized by the far wall. Finally, the smell of the hot stew hit him, a scent so completely foreign to his solitary, hard-scrabble existence that it rooted him to the floorboards. His gaze landed on Maeve. She was standing by the stove, her red hair tied back with a piece of twine, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. She didn't shrink back when he entered. She stood tall, meeting his stare with striking, defiant blue eyes. Ronan looked at her bandaged hands, noting the fresh, faint spots of red seeping through the linen where the blisters had protested the work. His heavy brows pulled together. "You should be resting those hands," he said, his voice a low rumble over the crackling fire. He dropped the hairs onto the washstand and began shrugging off his heavy bear-hide coat. "I'm not a delicate parlor ornament, Mr. Hayes," Maeve replied evenly, tapping the spoon against the rim of the pot. "And I'm not a charity case. I earn my keep." Ronan paused, his coat half off his broad shoulders. He studied her. He had seen women break under a fraction of what she had endured at the mining camp. He had seen grown men weep on this mountain. But the woman standing in his cabin, armed with nothing but a paring knife and stubborn pride, had already begun to conquer it. "I bought a piece of paper, Maeve," Ronan said quietly, stepping closer to the warmth of the stove. "I didn't buy you. The ledger is clear." "The ledger with Dawson is clear," Maeve corrected, turning back to the stew. "But I owe myself, and I refuse to be a guest in a home I haven't earned." Ronan watched the stiff, proud line of her spine. Her brothers had priced her at $300 and thrown her away like useless gravel. They were fools, looking at the fierce, capable woman who had just turned his cold fortress into a home. The mountain devil realized they had discarded the only real treasure their family possessed. "Plates are on the top shelf," Ronan said softly, pulling out a chair. "I'll skin the hares after we eat." By the third day, the blizzard did not just blow, it screamed. The heavy cedar logs groaned under the weight of the accumulating snow, and the cabin became a tiny, isolated island in a roaring white ocean. Inside, the rhythm of survival had settled into a quiet, synchronized dance. Maeve kept the iron stove fed and the meals prepared, while Ronan mended harness leather and sharpened his tools. The claustrophobia that usually accompanied being trapped indoors with a stranger never materialized. Instead, the small space felt incredibly, dangerously safe. On the fourth evening, the wind abruptly shifted. A violent downdraft slammed into the stone chimney, blowing a thick, choking cloud of grey smoke and hot ash back into the room through the stove's iron grates. Maeve coughed, her eyes watering instantly as she backed away from the sudden heat. Ronan was on his feet in a heartbeat. He didn't waste time with words. He grabbed his heavy leather gauntlets, threw open the heavy oak door to a blinding wall of snow, and forced his way outside to clear the obstructed chimney cap. He returned 10 minutes later, bringing a blast of freezing wind with him. He slammed the door shut, dropping the heavy iron latch. He was covered in soot, ice, and melted snow. His heavy bear hide coat was soaked through, and the freezing water had seeped into his dark wool shirt beneath. "The draft is clear," Ronan rasped, coughing out a lungful of residual smoke. He shucked off the heavy coat, tossing it over a wooden chair to dry. Realizing the wet wool shirt would pull the heat straight from his bones, Ronan gripped the hem and pulled it over his head. He stood by the roaring stove, the orange firelight dancing across his massive, heavily muscled chest and shoulders. Maeve, stepping forward with a clean linen towel to offer him, froze. The faint scar she had seen on the side of his neck the first night was merely the tip of a grotesque tapestry. The jagged, puckered flesh crawled down his collarbone, branching across his left shoulder and chest like a strike of melted lightning. It was thick, ropey tissue, the undeniable mark of a severe burn, and a deep, ragged blade wound that had healed poorly. Ronan caught her staring. His jaw tightened, and he moved to turn away, the familiar instinct of a man used to being looked at with horror. "That wasn't an animal," Maeve said softly. Her voice lacked any trace of the fear he expected. She stepped closer, handing him the towel. Ronan took the linen, wiping the melted ice from his face. He looked at the fire, the shadows deepening the hollows of his cheeks. 10 years ago, he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble in the quiet cabin. A mining camp down near the Washoe claim. 3 drifters cornered a laundress in a supply shed. When she fought back, they barred the door from the outside and set the timber on fire to hide what they tried to do. Maeve's breath hitched, her fingers grazing the fabric of her own apron. "I broke the door down," Ronan continued, his gray eyes cold and distant as he stared into the flames. "Got her out, but the men were still there." He stopped rubbing his neck with the towel. He looked down at his massive, calloused hands. "I didn't leave enough of them for the frontier law to hang. I tore them apart. The town arrived after the fire died down. They didn't see the woman I pulled from the flames. They only saw the blood in the snow, and the man standing in the middle of it." He looked at Maeve, waiting for the inevitable flinch, the step backward. "That's why they call me the devil. Because when the world gets ugly, I don't ask for mercy. I match it." Maeve didn't step back. She looked at the terrifying ruin of his shoulder, and then up into his clear, piercing eyes. She thought of Dawson, of her brothers, of the men who smiled while they stripped a woman of her humanity. "A brutal world doesn't respect a gentle man, Ronan," Maeve said, using his given name for the first time. Her voice was fiercely steady. "It only respects a bigger threat. They called you a devil because they were terrified to admit that sometimes violence is the only thing that protects the innocent." She reached out with her healing, bandaged hand and gently rested her fingertips against the unscarred skin of his forearm. It was a fleeting, feather-light touch, but it carried the weight of absolute trust. Ronan's breath shuddered. He looked down at her small hand on his arm, a profound, unnameable emotion cracking his stoic mask. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't looking at a woman who feared him. But as Maeve pulled her hand back, her eyes caught a flash of white. Sticking halfway out of the inner pocket of the heavy bear-hide coat draped over the chair was a thick, folded piece of paper.
"I needed to know you were safe."
I am.
"I recognize this seal. Where did this come from?" "It was found among the papers." "I recognize this seal. Where did this come from?"
The Promissory Note. The forged chain that still legally bound her to him. The warmth in the cabin suddenly felt a little colder. The warmth that had just blossomed between them vanished, sucked into the cold draft of memory. Maeve's eyes remained locked on the thick, folded piece of paper protruding from the inner pocket of the bear-hide coat draped over the chair. The crisp, white edges were stark against the dark, wet fur. She knew exactly what it was. The heavy parchment, the dark ink bleeding through the fold. The Promissory Note. Maeve took a slow step backward, putting distance between herself and the massive man standing by the stove. The newfound trust she had felt seconds ago shattered, replaced by the cornered panic of a woman who remembered she carried a price tag. Ronan watched her retreat. He saw the color drain from her freckled face, saw her eyes dart from the coat to the door, calculating a hopeless escape into the blizzard. He followed her line of sight, spotting the paper. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't raise his voice. He reached out, the heavy muscles of his scarred shoulder flexing in the firelight, and pulled the folded paper from the pocket of his coat. "You kept it," Maeve said, her voice shaking with a potent mix of betrayal and fury. She crossed her arms over her chest, her bandaged hands curling into tight fists. "You told me the ledger was clear. You said you didn't buy me." "I didn't," Ronan replied, his deep voice remarkably gentle, a stark contrast to his intimidating frame. "Then throw it in the stove," Maeve challenged, her chin lifting defiantly. "Burn it right now. If I'm a free woman, that paper means nothing. unless you're keeping it to remind me who holds the leash." Ronan looked at the flames roaring behind the iron grate. It would be so easy to toss the forged document into the fire, to watch the ink curl and blacken, to give her the immediate satisfaction of seeing her chains turn to ash. But he had survived a decade on the unforgiving frontier because he understood how brutal men operated. He turned back to Maeve, holding the paper loosely in his large, calloused hand. "If I burn this, Maeve, you are legally a runaway." Maeve frowned, the sheer panic giving way to confusion. "It's a forgery." "It's a piece of paper signed by your bloodkin, recognized by the camp boss," Ronan corrected, his tone flat and pragmatic. "Out here, that's all the law there is. Dawson is a greedy man. Your brothers are cowards. Come the spring thaw, when the mountain passes open, they might come looking. Dawson might decide $300 wasn't enough to cover his bruised pride." He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. He didn't cross her boundaries, stopping a respectful distance away. "If Dawson comes up this ridge and this paper is ashes, it becomes his word against yours. He'll say you stole from him. He'll say the debt was never paid. He'll bring the camp marshals, and they will drag you back down the mountain in irons." Ronan held the folded paper out, not to give it to her, but to show her the weight of it. "As long as this paper exists, and as long as my name is on the transfer, I hold the claim, which means no man in the territory can lay a hand on you without answering to me first. Dawson knows it. The marshals know it." Maeve stared at the promissory note, the reality of his words sinking in. He wasn't keeping the paper to own her. He was keeping it to build an impenetrable legal wall around her. He was using the very instrument of her enslavement as a shield. "I am not your master, Maeve," Ronan said, his voice lowering to a rough whisper. "I am your barrier. I keep this so that when the snow melts and the roads clear, you can walk into any town, stand before any judge, and prove that your debt was bought and legally dissolved. Not stolen, not abandoned, cleared." He stepped forward, finally closing the distance, and gently placed the folded paper onto the wooden table between them. "When the thaw comes," Ronan vowed, his gray eyes locking onto hers with absolute, unshakable sincerity, "you will take this paper to the Oakhaven Bank. You will have the clerk stamp it null and void, and then you will tear it up yourself. Until then, I hold the line." Maeve looked from the paper to the towering, scarred man who had just dismantled her deepest fear with nothing but quiet, terrifying logic. The mountain devil wasn't a beast who hoarded treasure. He was a guardian who stood in the dark so she could stand in the light. Her bandaged hands relaxed. The phantom weight of the heavy canvas apron and the blistering lye water faded, replaced by the profound, overwhelming warmth of being truly, unconditionally safe. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the 6th day. The howling wind died, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence, and a world buried under 3 feet of pristine, blinding white snow. Ronan left the cedar cabin shortly after dawn. The heavy snowfall meant the trap lines needed to be dug out, and the perimeter checked for predators driven close by hunger. More importantly, he needed to clear the heavy widowmakers. Massive dead branches snapped by the storm, left dangling precariously in the pine canopy, waiting to drop on an unsuspecting target. Maeve stayed behind, tending to the cabin. Her hands were healing. The raw, weeping blisters from the mining camp's lye water had dried, replaced by tough, resilient calluses. She moved around the small space with practiced efficiency, no longer a captive waiting for permission, but a partner maintaining the sanctuary. By late afternoon, the sun dipped behind the jagged western peaks, casting long, bruised blue shadows across the snowpack. Maeve stood by the small window, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Ronan was a man of methodical precision. He calculated daylight like a banker calculated coin. He should have been back an hour ago. Suddenly, the mule in the lean-to let out a sharp, anxious bray. Maeve didn't hesitate. She threw open the heavy oak door. The freezing air bit into her face, but her eyes locked onto the tree line. Emerging from the dark timber was Ronan. He wasn't walking with his usual terrifying, silent grace. He was leaning heavily on a thick pine branch, acting as a makeshift crutch, dragging his right leg. A dark, wet stain covered the entire right side of his canvas trousers, freezing into a grim crust in the cold. Maeve didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She dropped the firewood she was holding and plunged into the knee-deep snow, her boots churning through the powder. She reached him just as his knee buckled. She slid under his massive left arm, bracing her sturdy frame against his side. The sheer, crushing weight of the mountain devil almost drove her into the snow, but Maeve planted her feet, wrapping her arm tightly around his thick waist. "Deadfall," Ronan grunted, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. His skin, usually ruddy from the wind, was a sickly, translucent pale. Branch snapped under the snow load, caught my thigh. "I've got you," Maeve said, her voice fierce and steady. "Keep moving, Ronan, just to the door." Together they hobbled the last 20 yards. It was a grueling, agonizing march. Maeve practically carried the left side of his body, her muscles burning under the strain, but she refused to let him fall. They crossed the threshold, and Ronan collapsed onto the bare pelts on the bed, the makeshift crutch clattering to the floorboards. The cedar cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a triage ward. Maeve didn't wait for instructions. She stoked the iron stove, shoving kindling into the flames until they roared, and hauled the heavy kettle of water over the heat. She walked to the bed and grabbed her paring knife, the same stolen blade she had hidden in her apron to kill Dawson. Now, it was a tool of salvation. She cut the heavy, blood-soaked canvas of his trousers away. The wound was horrific. A thick, jagged splinter of pine, the size of a railroad spike, was driven deep into the heavy muscle of his outer thigh. Dark blood pulsed sluggishly around the wood. "It has to come out," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a clinical, flat calm. If she panicked, he would bleed to death. Ronan looked at the wound, then up at her face. He saw no tears, no trembling. He saw the woman who had survived the mud in the mess hall, the woman who refused to be broken. He reached out and gripped the heavy timber headboard of the bed. His knuckles turned white. "Do it," he rasped. Maeve poured a liberal splash of high-proof whiskey over her hands and the blade of the knife. She didn't count to 3. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She pressed her left hand firmly against his thigh to steady the muscle, gripped the jagged end of the wood, and pulled smoothly and violently. Ronan let out a guttural, chest-deep roar, his massive body arching off the bed as the wood tore free. Blood welled up instantly, spilling over Maeve's hands. She dropped the splinter, grabbed a clean wad of linen, and pressed her entire body weight against the wound to staunch the flow. Ronan gasped, his chest heaving, his eyes squeezed shut against the blinding agony. Maeve held the pressure, her hands steeped in his blood, counting the seconds in the terrifying silence of the cabin. Minutes passed. The bleeding finally slowed. Maeve flushed, a deep puncture with raw whiskey, drawing another sharp hiss from Ronan, and bound the thigh tightly with long strips of clean linen. When it was done, she sat back on her heels on the floorboards, her chest rising and falling. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline receding, leaving behind a cold exhaustion. Ronan opened his eyes. He looked at the tight, professional bandage on his leg, and then at Maeve. She was covered in his blood, her red hair clinging to her damp forehead, but she hadn't flinched when it mattered. "You didn't turn away," Ronan whispered, his voice thick with exhaustion and absolute awe. "I told you, Ronan," Maeve replied, wiping a streak of blood from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "I earn my keep." Ronan closed his eyes, the phantom weight of his solitary, cursed existence finally breaking. The mountain devil had saved her from the camp, but the Collateral girl had just saved his life. They were no longer protector and protected. They were equals. By late April, the mountain began to weep. The brutal, frozen silence of the deep winter was gradually replaced by the relentless sound of melting ice. The heavy snowpack receded, revealing dark, wet earth, and the creeks swelled into roaring torrents of freezing white water. The thaw had come. Ronan was walking again. He relied on a thick cedar staff if he had carved himself, favoring his right leg, where the thick, puckered scar now mirrored the brutal marks on his chest. His recovery was a testament to Maeve's relentless care. Over the past month, she had boiled willow bark for his fever, changed his dressings with clinical precision, and kept the cabin running without a single word of complaint. But as the days grew longer and the air lost its biting edge, the comfortable, well-oiled rhythm they had established began to fracture. A new, heavy silence settled over the cedar cabin. It wasn't the silence of strangers, but the agonizing quiet of two people deeply tethered to one another, both stubbornly refusing to pull the rope. One evening, after the supper dishes were cleared and the iron stove was banked to a low, glowing hum, Ronan sat at the wooden table. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy bear-hide coat and pulled out the folded piece of heavy paper. The edges were slightly worn now, but the dark ink of the forged promissory note remained stark and clear. He placed it on the table between them. The sound of the paper brushing the rough wood was louder than the rushing creek outside. "The southern pass is clear," Ronan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't look at her. His piercing gray eyes remained fixed on the document. "Mud is thick, but the mules can make the descent. We leave for Oakhaven at first light." Maeve sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The calluses on her palms were tough and smooth now. She looked at the paper, and a cold, hollow sensation dropped in her stomach, a chill far worse than the blizzard had ever been. "To the bank," Maeve said, her voice betraying a slight tremor she immediately hated. "To the bank," Ronan confirmed, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. "We present the note. The clerk stamps it null and void. The debt is legally dissolved on the territory ledger, as I promised. And then, Maeve asked, her blue eyes searching his stoic, scarred face for any crack, any sign that he wanted to tear the paper up right here and tell her to stay. And then, you're a free woman, Ronan replied evenly, though his jaw tightened. He reached out and tapped the table with a calloused finger. Stagecoach runs south to Denver twice a week. You can take whatever supplies you need. The furs I trapped this winter will fetch a high price. I'll split the coin with you. Wages for running the cabin and pulling that timber out of my leg. He was giving her everything. Freedom, protection, money, and an escape from the brutal frontier. He was doing it because he believed a vibrant, intelligent woman like Maeve Calder belonged in a real town, in a real home, not trapped on a lonely ridge with a scarred, violent man the world called a devil. He loved her. In the quiet, desperate way a starving man loves bread. But he would let her walk onto that stagecoach because it was the honorable thing to do. Maeve swallowed hard. She heard the finality in his tone and misinterpreted it completely. He kept his word, she thought bitterly. He bought my debt to save me, but he never wanted a partner. He just wants his solitary mountain back. I don't need your trapping money, Ronan, Maeve said softly, standing up from the table. She didn't reach for the paper, but I will be ready at dawn. The next morning smelled sharply of wet pine and thawing mud. The air was crisp, lacking the deadly bite of winter. Ronan secured the heavy canvas bales of prime winter pelts onto the mule, using a flawless diamond hitch. He pulled his wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes, leaning his weight onto the cedar staff. Maeve stood on the small porch, wearing her cleaned homespun dress and the heavy canvas apron, her red hair pinned up tightly once more. She looked at the sturdy cedar cabin, the fortress that had been her first true home, and then turned her back on it. "Stay close to the mule," Ronan instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. "The trail washes out near the ravine." They began the descent. With every mile they dropped in elevation, the clean, white sanctuary of the mountain faded, replaced by the sucking, treacherous brown mud of the lower valley. They were heading back to Oakhaven, back to Dawson, back to T.E. miners, and back to the brutal reality of the world that had thrown her away. The smell of Oakhaven hit them 2 miles before the timber broke. It was a suffocating stench of burning coal, raw sewage, and stale beer, a sickening contrast to the crisp, pine-scented air of the high ridge. As Ronan and Maeve descended into the valley, the sprawling mining camp revealed itself. The spring thaw had turned the single main thoroughfare into a churning, knee-deep river of brown mud, churned by the hooves of pack mules and the boots of desperate men. The boardwalks were crowded with transient miners returning for the season, their faces grimy and eyes hollow with gold fever. When Ronan stepped out of the tree line leading his pack mule, the ambient noise of the camp noticeably dipped. Word traveled fast on the frontier. The men remembered the blizzard 6 months ago. They remembered the terrifying mountain devil slamming a pouch of raw gold onto a mess hall table and dragging the camp boss's collateral up into the freezing void. Most had placed bets that the girl would be dead in a week, frozen or torn apart by the beast who bought her. Yet, here she was. Maeve Calder walked beside the giant, not trailing behind him like a beaten dog. Her red hair was pinned up sharply, her chin lifted high. Her striking blue eyes, scanning the crowds with an icy, unafraid clarity. She wore the same homespun dress and canvas apron, but she looked hardened, forged by the winter. Ronan walked with a heavy limp, leaning on his carved cedar staff, but the injury did not diminish his terrifying presence. If anything, the wounded, deliberate way he moved made him look like a scarred grizzly that had survived a trap, infinitely more dangerous. They made their way down the boardwalk, heading straight for the solid brick front of the Oakhaven Bank and assayer's office. Before they could reach the steps, the heavy double doors of the adjacent saloon swung open. Silas Dawson stepped out, a lit cigar clamped between his yellowed teeth. He was flanked by 4 of his largest camp enforcers. He took one look at Maeve, his eyes raking over her, and then settled his venomous gaze on Ronan. "Well, look what the thaw dragged out of the dirt," Dawson sneered, stepping squarely into their path. He hooked his thumbs into his gun belt. "Heard a widowmaker broke your leg, Hayes. Surprised you didn't eat your little investment to survive the winter." Ronan stopped. He didn't tighten his grip on his staff. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let his ice-clear gray eyes lock onto Dawson. "Move aside, Dawson. Our business is with the bank." "Not anymore at a..." Dawson replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. He gestured to the men gathering around them. "Camp council met over the winter, Hayes. We decided a wild dog living outside the bounds of civilized law can't legally hold a labor contract. The paper you bought is void. The girl's debt reverts back to the camp." It was a blatant, fabricated lie, an excuse built on Dawson's bruised ego and greed. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward Maeve's arm. "Come on back to the mess hall, girlie. You owe me 6 months of interest." Before Dawson's fingers could even brush the canvas of Maeve's apron, the heavy cedar staff in Ronan's hand swept upward in a blindingly fast arc. It cracked viciously against Dawson's wrist. The camp boss howled, snatching his hand back against his chest as the bone fractured with a sickening pop. The 4 enforcers instantly reached for their iron. Ronan didn't flinch. He dropped the staff. His right hand blurred, drawing the heavy hunting knife from his thigh, while his left hand threw back the edge of his bear hide coat to reveal the worn walnut grip of a heavy Colt revolver tucked into his belt. The jagged, terrifying scar on his neck seemed to pull tight as his jaw locked. "The next man who touches his iron," Ronan growled, his voice vibrating with absolute lethal promise, "dies in the mud." The enforcers froze. They looked at the massive, scarred man, weighing their wages against their lives. Nobody moved. Maeve didn't cower behind Ronan's broad back. She stepped up, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. She looked at Dawson, who was cradling his broken wrist, his face pale with agony and shock. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified. But she had survived the deep freeze. She had held a man's torn flesh together with her bare, blistered hands. These men were nothing but noise and dirt. "I don't owe you a single cent, Dawson," Maeve said, her voice ringing clear and steady over the silent crowd. "And I am not your property. The debt was bought, and today it gets canceled." Dawson glared at her, sweating from the pain, but he took a slow, agonizing step backward, yielding the path to the bank. Ronan picked up his staff, his eyes never leaving the thugs. "Let's go, Maeve." They stepped past the broken camp boss and climbed the wooden stairs toward the bank doors. But just as Ronan reached for the brass handle, a voice rang out from the muddy street. A voice Maeve hadn't heard in 6 months. A voice that made the blood freeze in her veins. "Hold on a minute there. That's our sister." "Maeve!" Liam shouted, pushing his way through the stunned crowd. He wore a cheap, flashy suit, the trousers already ruined by the Oakhaven mud. Seamus trailed closely behind him, his eyes darting nervously toward the giant standing on the bank steps. "Thank God," Liam briefed, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. He tried to muster a look of brotherly relief, but his eyes gleamed with opportunistic greed. "We heard the mountain devil dragged you off. We came back as soon as we struck a vein, Maeve. We came to buy you back." Maeve looked down at the 2 men who shared her blood. 6 months ago, the sight of them leaving her in the mess hall had almost broken her spirit. Now, looking at their soft hands and cowardly eyes, she felt nothing but a cold, absolute clarity. "You didn't strike a vein, Liam," Maeve said, her voice ringing with icy contempt. "You lost whatever Dawson paid you at a faro table, and you came back to see if he'd front you more." Liam's false smile faltered, his face flushed with anger. He took a step up the wooden stairs, his patriarchal pride wounded in front of the camp. "Don't take that tone with me. You're our blood. You're coming with us. And you," Liam pointed a trembling finger at Ronan, "if you laid a hand on her, you owe our family compensation." Ronan didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He simply shifted his massive weight, stepping slightly in front of Maeve. His ice-clear gray eyes locked onto Liam with the dead, flat stare of an apex predator. "She ain't your family." Ronan's voice was a low, vibrating rumble.